Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Indivisible MNO3, I would like to welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Heidi Stroman, and I am the Vice Chair of our all-volunteer group. Indivisible MNO3 was formed in January 2017. We are a grassroots movement based in Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District. Our mission is to promote progressive values, defend and strengthen our democracy, and combat authoritarianism. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. David Schultz as our guest speaker. He is a distinguished university professor of political science and legal studies at Hamline University, and a widely respected expert on election law, public policy, and democratic institutions. He brings both academic depth and real-world legal experience to his analysis. Dr. Schultz has spent decades studying the mechanics of elections, how they're administered, how laws shape voter access, and how public trust is built or eroded. His clear, accessible explanations have made him a go-to voice for journalists, policymakers, and civic organizations seeking to understand the pressures and possibilities facing our electoral system. Tonight, he joins us to discuss the current state of elections in Minnesota and the U.S. We will examine forces that threaten free and fair elections and address how we, as concerned citizens, can work to protect this critical cornerstone of our democracy. Dr. Schultz will open with his prepared remarks, after which we will invite you to join the conversation actively by offering up your questions. If you have a question for Dr. Schultz at that time, we would ask that you step up to the microphone so all can hear. If you prefer to submit a question in writing, please use the index cards that were made available as you entered, or grab a card from one of our volunteers in the aisles. Now please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. David Schultz.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. And so what I want to do tonight is to walk through a variety of different issues. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the right to vote in the United States, both under U.S. Constitution and under state constitution. I want to talk a little bit about how voting is regulated or administered across the United States. I want to talk a little bit, which gets into election administration issues. I want to talk about to what extent it would be possible to rig, I'll use, lack of a better word, rig elections, and then get into some questions here regarding, for example, what we know about what I'm going to call some of the rumors, hysteria, superstitions surrounding a lot of type of issues in terms of voting in elections in America. I'm going to start off with a real simple statement. There is no right to vote in the United States, period. So something I point out to my students is that if you pick up the Constitution, take a look at it, read through it, at no point will you find anywhere explicitly written in the U.S. Constitution that there is a right to vote. I'm going to talk about where that right does come from, but there is nothing unequivocally written that absolutely grants us a right to vote in the United States. And to understand why, we need to go back to 1787. 1787 is the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. And in terms of understanding what was going on in 1787, keep in mind to start with that across the world, there was no such thing known as democracies. If you looked across the world, we had principalities, we had monarchies, maybe we had military governments. But the idea of people being able to choose their leaders was a completely foreign and strange concept in the world at that point. And as historians such as James McGregor Burns and others have pointed out, what made America unique in 1787 was the concept of an experiment in the idea of popular democracy, the idea that eventually would be embodied in the Constitution in the first 3 words of "We the People." However, to understand how and where the Constitution went at that point, understanding that we were this experiment, understanding that we were an experiment in something called popular democracy, we still have to nonetheless understand that in 1787, there was an incredible amount of distrust amount of distrust and fear among lots of different constituencies regarding the creation of a new national government. And how this plays out, some of you might remember from some of your textbooks when you were in college or in high school, or at some point along the line there, is that going into 1787, Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, we had, for example, a fight going on between what we call the big states and the small states in terms of representation in Congress. And in that representation in Congress, there were proposals being made. Initially, the state of Virginia said, in the new national legislature, which we would call the Congress, we would like to have voting in Congress based upon population. Of course, this did not play well with the smaller states, such as Delaware and so forth like that, that feared that if it was based upon population, who of course would pay attention to the small states. So then we had what was called the New Jersey plan that said, well, instead, let's have every state have an equal representation in Congress. That, of course, didn't play well with the big states. And then, of course, you had eventually the Connecticut plan, which was the compromise that said that some representation would be based upon population, that is, the House of Representatives. Some would be based upon equality, i.e. the Senate. But that was the first of the compromises. So if we now think about it, if we're now going to say that we are going to have, at least in some way, shape, or form, some representation, at least in the House of Representatives, that's going to be based upon population, we now have to figure out who's going to count in terms of population. And of course, the southern states came in and said, we would like everybody, including the slaves, to count as population, although, of course, we're not going to give them any kind of rights. And we don't want slaves counted for the purposes of what? For taxation. The northern states come back and say, we don't exactly like that idea. That if you're not going to, if you're going to want them to count for the purposes of the census and population representation, they better count for taxes. What's the compromise? The 3/5 compromise. That we were going to count persons of color, those including in servitude, as 3/5 persons for representation. Compromise number 2. Compromise number 3 is, all right, since we are now going to talk about representation, and we're going to talk about who counts for the purposes of representation, now the question becomes, how do we actually go about choosing our representatives? Significant debate going on, and eventually it's resolved to say that, guess what? The President of the United States will not be directly elected by the people of the United States. We will create this thing called the Electoral College, where state legislators pick electors who pick the President of the United States. Additionally, and people forget this, that under the original Constitution, the U.S. Senate was not directly elected by the people, that it was picked also by the state legislators. But then we get down to the House of Representatives. How do we pick the House of Representatives? Who gets to pick them? This is where we finally get down to the question of voting rights. And this is where, to use a totally non-legal term, the Constitutional Convention punts and says, we can't agree on the issue of voting rights. We're not even going to discuss this. Partly because of why? Because of what? The slave states protesting about these issues, as well as the northern states were protesting about these issues. Because if we start to discuss the issue of voting rights, then maybe we have to talk about poor people voting. And of course, you can't consider that. So the Constitution left absent the discussion of voting rights. No language in there whatsoever. But it was left up to the states to decide who would vote and who would not vote. It was left up to the states in terms of eligibility and structure for running their elections. That eventually would appear in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, that generally says states have the authority to determine eligibility for elections, including the time, manner, and place, but the U.S. government, Congress, could step in to potentially regulate the time, manner, and place for federal elections. I'm going to want to keep this in mind, this distinction here, between state elections. When I say state elections, I also mean local versus federal elections. And by federal, eventually I mean the House of Representatives, the Senate, as well as the President. But then, in 1787, who was eligible to vote under state law? If I had a board behind me, I would write a small word on the board with an abbreviation. The letters would be WASPS $21N. And what that would say is that eligibility to vote across the country, pretty much everywhere, across 13 states, you had to be white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, had to have real land, not just money, you actually had to own land, you had to be male, and you had to be at least age 21, if not older. That's who was legally entitled to vote in the United States under state law at that point. And one of the things that I want to point out to you is that even if we move roughly 250 years to the present, there is still no positive, affirmative, absolute language in the U.S. Constitution that grants the right to vote. Some of you may or may not be old enough to remember Florida 2000, Bush v. Gore, where the elections melted down there. And in Bush v. Gore, that famous court case there, part of the dispute was all about the allocation of the electors that were being disputed in the vote counts in Florida. And what the Supreme Court reminded us is that, guess what? There still is no right to vote for President of the United States. Tomorrow, if the state of Minnesota said, we are not going to let you vote for President of the United States, we are instead going to empower the state legislature to pick the electors, to pick the President of the United States. You know what? They could do that. And unless we fought back, they could do that. But you're now saying, has everything frozen since that time? Not necessarily. What about, you're going to say, all these constitutional amendments and so forth? Let me walk you through some history. And yes, if we look at where we were in 1787, in terms of who was legally allowed to vote, most of those restrictions have been dropped over time. And we could walk through a variety of different bits of language and different things that have happened over time. For example, some of you might say, well, didn't after the Civil War, we passed the 15th Amendment that granted former slaves or persons of color the right to vote? Sort of. If you read the text of the 15th Amendment, it merely says that persons shall not be denied the right to vote on account of former servitude, ethnicity, or color. It doesn't say a right to vote. It says you can't use slavery, servitude, race, or ethnicity to deny people the right to vote. Some of you might say, but what about the 19th Amendment that granted women right to vote? Read the amendment. It says the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. It doesn't affirmatively say people have the right to vote, merely cannot deny them the right to vote on account of sex. Or some of you might say, what about the 26th Amendment in 1971, which said 18-year-olds had the right to vote? Again, notice what it says. The right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of age, of a certain age. Notice those three amendments. None of them affirmatively say a right to vote. They merely say that you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of certain things. Additionally, over time, we can also look at other legislation or constitutional amendments when it has come to voting rights. For example, We did, in the early part of the 20th century, change the process for how people are selecting senators, and to say that what? That senators would no longer be picked by state legislatures, but they could be picked by the people. But it still didn't say what? Still didn't say what people and who's eligible. In 1924, we adopted, and I'm going to use the original names, so hopefully nobody's offended here. We adopted the Indian Bill of Rights that said that Native Americans would be able to basically participate, or U.S. citizens, and could participate. But it still doesn't affirmatively grant Native Americans the right to vote. In 1964, we abolished the poll tax, a law that basically had required people to pay a small fee to be able to vote. Got rid of that. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, arguably one of the greatest pieces of legislation in American history, significantly did an amazingly good job in terms of increasing the ability of people of color, especially in the South, to be able to vote. All whittling away on what? Restrictions on voting rights. But still you're asking, Professor Schultz, where does it say that I have a right to vote? There still is nothing explicit in the Constitution. Where does the right to vote come from? In a couple of places. For example, one of them we could look to a Supreme Court case called United States versus Classic, a case that was decided in the, if I get my correct date here, it's in the 1950s, I think it is, 1950s, 1951, I think it is, and it said the right to vote in federal elections is found in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution says the right that Congress, the House of Representatives, shall be chosen by the people. And the court said that's where the federal right to vote is. Still doesn't say what people. What about the right to vote in local and state elections? It's not until the 1960s, in cases like Reynolds versus Sims, that the U.S. Supreme Court says that the First Amendment, which talks about freedom of speech and so forth, do we find a right to vote? But nonetheless, think about this. Think about what I'm saying here, is that if we look at the U.S. Constitution, still no right whatsoever to vote for the President of the United States. Still no affirmative language anywhere in the text of the Constitution that guarantees a right to vote in federal or state elections. At best, what we have is that the Supreme Court has said that in Article 1, Section 2, and in the First Amendment, we can infer a right to vote. But even then, what the court has said is that the right to vote is not absolute, that it's subject to limitations that can be imposed. And what we know is that there are a lot of limitations that have been imposed over time. The story that I'm starting to tell here is that on one level, we could look at America as Thurgood Marshall once said. Thurgood Marshall, former Supreme Court Justice, said at one point on the bicentennial of the Constitution that in 1787, the first three words of the Constitution read, "We the people." And he said in 1787, "We the people" was hardly inclusive, it was mostly exclusive. But his argument was that we fought a civil war, a civil rights revolution, and with 26 or 27 amendments, we've gradually expanded that right. But it's still not unlimited. Alongside of this gradual expansion of the right to vote, there has also been an effort on a counter effort to try to suppress the right to vote. Post-Civil War, we saw a dramatic expansion of the right to vote, especially in the South during Reconstruction. only for Reconstruction to end with the 1876 election. We ushered then in a period of what I and others call the first great disenfranchisement in American history. That during Reconstruction, the South elected people of color to the Senate, to the House, to governorships, to state legislatures. But what was ushered in was also what's called the era of Jim Crow, an effort to suppress the right to vote. A variety of techniques, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, I can explain some of those later if you want, were used to suppress the right to vote, and they were hugely successful. By the time we got to 1900, barely 1% of persons of color in the South were able to vote. That's pretty effective suppression. Fast forward us to the 1950s to the 1960s. Again, things such as the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all again dramatically expanded the right to vote for individuals, as I noted before. But since roughly the year 2000, we're entering to what I would call the second great disenfranchisement in American history. If in the first great disenfranchisement, it was the Democratic Party, the party of the South, the party of Dixie, that was behind trying to suppress the right to vote. We now see what? An effort that's partisan yet again since 2000 regarding the suppression of the right to vote. First, it was the argument about voter fraud, an argument that asserted that there is widespread voter fraud in America. I and others have written about this and have argued, and I'll put it into a great context here. You have a better chance of buying a Powerball ticket and winning the Powerball than you do in showing that voter fraud has affected the outcome of an election in America. I can't even describe the decimal points, 0.00000, et cetera, in terms of the amount of fraud that occurs in the country. Several years ago, I worked with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at the University of Arizona, and we documented the amount of proven allegations of voter fraud in America over multiple elections. Again, we're talking about infinitesimally small. Again, put it into Powerball comparisons in terms of it. But first, it started with the claim of voter fraud. And therefore, we needed to do things like have voter IDs. We needed to have all these different techniques in place to ensure that there was no voter fraud. In fact, in the most famous case where the U.S. Supreme Court, about 15 years ago, upheld, in 2008, upheld voter IDs in Indiana, the state of Indiana asserted in its own brief that in the entire history of the state, they did not have a single documented case of voter fraud. And then since then, by introducing voter fraud or voter ID, still none. Well, because their whole argument for why we needed voter ID is that we would be able to flesh out or smoke out voter fraud. Well, you would think that in fact we now have voter ID. We would see people rushing to the voter booths, and we would catch them with voter ID. The fact of the matter is, we don't. And so, of course, for those who claim there's widespread voter fraud, they would say, see that? The voter ID worked. We suppressed people who were fraudulently voting, even though we had no evidence initially to show that there was, in fact, any fraud. Moreover, as I point out to my friends and many people, at a point where we have barely 60% voter turnout in national elections, we have barely 40% that turn out in midterm elections. We get down to state and local elections, we sometimes are lucky to get 10 to 15%. The image that people are going to rush off to the voting booth to potentially commit felony fraud belies the reality of the voter statistics in the United States. So, we have no evidence, no credible evidence of widespread voter fraud in America. That's not going to win the argument, though, because people made up their minds. But what we then saw emerge in 2020 is not just the idea that there was widespread voter fraud, but the idea that we had what? Stolen elections. And among the allegations was letting people vote early, and then maybe not having their ballots counted until after election day, even though they were postmarked at an appropriate time, was somehow fraudulent or illegitimate. And there are efforts, including a case before the Supreme Court, where the Trump Justice Department is trying to argue that in federal elections, that is wrong. We can't allow that to happen. And we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the litigation, because, as I will point out here, the Roberts Court has been absolutely hostile to voting rights. Horrible at it. But we know that based upon these claims, and the Brennan Center has documented this, in the last 4 years, we have seen over 500 pieces of legislation across 40 states trying to figure out ways to make it more difficult to vote. Cutting back on early voting, cutting back on voting booths, imposing other restrictions in terms of voting. We are in the middle, and I argued this in a piece in the William Mitchell Law Review back in 2008. We are in the middle of the second great disenfranchisement in American history. An effort to yet again rig or I'll just say with that word, to rig the elections. It's important to understand that this is what's going on right now. Now, I've been talking about the issue right now, too, of federal elections. That, in general, in the United States, we have elections that are run by, including the federal elections that are run by the states, which in turn delegate down to local authority. Unlike, for example, most other countries in the world where there's a National Election Commission, a national body that oversees the elections, we have an incredibly decentralized system. And even for federal elections, primary responsibility for eligibility to vote, election administration, et cetera, all falls to the states. However, as I pointed out to you, Congress, through the Constitution, does have the authority to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections. Could Congress, if it passes a law, that the president signs into law, regulate some things regarding federal elections? Yeah, they could do that. They have somewhat broad latitude, not unlimited, but broad latitude to do it. But could they regulate state elections? The answer is no. Not easily, for a couple of reasons. First, go back to when the right to vote, the 26th Amendment, was adopted. Originally, it was state legislation, or rather, I correct myself, it was federal legislation that lowered the voting age to age 18 for federal and state elections. The U.S. Supreme Court came back and said, you can change the voting age for federal elections, but you have no power over state elections. That's why we had the constitutional amendment. So it is not easy for the federal government to regulate elections that are purely state. And as we know, states hold their elections at the same time with the federal. If the feds wanted to come in and do what? Truly wanted to come in and say, we're going to completely change the rules about voting at the federal level, they would have to set up their own apparatus for doing voting and elections separate from the states. Could they do it? Yes. Would it be expensive? It would be hugely expensive to do something like that, but not impossible. But at the state level, what could the state of Minnesota do? People oftentimes forget, we've got a state constitution. And in Minnesota, Article 7 of the Minnesota Constitution grants individuals the right to vote. All 50 states in the United States have affirmative language granting the right to vote. Again, not an absolute right to vote, but pretty significant. And in the state of Minnesota, we also do that. And in a famous case, Kahn versus Griffin, Phyllis Kahn, some of you might remember, was a state legislator. There was a case that went to the Minnesota Supreme Court about the right to vote. And this Minnesota Supreme Court said the right to vote is fundamental. And in case you're wondering why I know about that case, I was Phyllis Kahn's attorney in that case. I represented her on that. What I'm getting at here is that it's important to understand two different regimes, federal versus state. States generally still operate and perform those federal elections. Additionally, we know in the state of Minnesota, which is true across every state in the country, that we have the states that generally delegate down to counties or cities for running their own election apparatus. That is, for example, county election boards, et cetera, like that. The reason why I mention this is think about how complicated, how hard it would be to rig an election in a system so decentralized as that. It would be incredibly complex to do so. On top of which, as I point out, that a lot of the elections and a lot of our election machinery is done hugely with volunteers, done who are people who are not paid. We allow for election observers. We allow for lots of opportunities for being able to check the process. What I'm getting at here are two different points here. A, if you truly wanted to rig an election, it would be very difficult to do so. And two, it would also be very difficult to manipulate elections because of what? All the moving parts and their people that are in there. A question that I pose to my students when they say to me sometimes, why can't we vote by our cell phones? Why can't we make that even easier to do so? To encourage more people to vote. I say to them, do you trust cell phones from being hacked? And they all say, Okay. The reason why I mention this is that we actually have, again, a pretty good system. If you were to bring in Steve Simon or before him Mark Ritchie, and I think Mark Ritchie was much more articulate about this in terms of bringing it up, is that we have an incredibly complex system out there for also how we record votes. We still do have what? Paper ballots in this here. Whether you vote in person or you vote remotely, that is like in advance or absentee. We've got the hard copy. Yes, it's been tabulated, but if there's a serious dispute about it, all else fails. What do election officials do? They can count paper. We've got a backup system. After elections, we have things called what? We have canvassing boards, which review elections. And as we learned when we had Coleman versus Franken, the disputed election of 2008, we have extensive processes for litigation to be able to challenge the right to vote. What I'm getting at here is our system isn't foolproof, but we have an incredible number of checks built into an incredibly decentralized, highly regulated system in this country regarding voting rights in this country. Not absolute voting rights, but voting rights that nonetheless are hard to tinker with from the election machinery point of view. And so what I want us to be thinking about is all of that. Now, what I want us to think about is also a couple of other things that I want to draw to a close my comments so we can spend the remainder of the time with questions and answers and so forth, is that I hear an incredible amount of panic. And I'm not saying panic is totally irrational, but we have to take deep breaths. We have to take deep breaths and think about where we are. For example, people are saying Trump is going to cancel elections. The elections are codified in law. It's going to take laws to be able to do that. Remember also that even if somehow one house can do that, on the other hand, because of the filibuster rule, it's going to probably be impossible to have it happen in the other house. My point being is that presidents alone can't use executive orders to cancel elections. Additionally, even if Congress were somehow to be able to do something like this, we still have some access to the courts to challenge all these things. Additionally, I think there would be, and we have to think about demonstration democracy. I'm not talking about violence, I'm not talking about civil war, but I'm not sure how the American public would go along with that. Additionally, I heard people saying things along the lines of, well, what if the president were to invoke the Insurrection Act? Doesn't the Insurrection Act mean we're under martial law? No, it does not mean that. The Insurrection Act, if invoked, would merely say that federal troops are allowed to help keep the peace. They can't enforce the law, and they are barred under the Posse Comitatus Act from being at voting booths. Moreover, as the courts have made clear, that the Insurrection Act does not mean suspension of the Constitution. That all the Bill of Rights provisions and all the rights that are already in place still apply even if the Insurrection Act were to kick in. But as I said to people, if somehow the president were to invoke martial law, then we have a whole different game that we've never experienced in American history. You're waiting for all of me to say it would never be never. I don't think that'll happen. But if you say to me, we're going to go under martial law, I don't know what an answer to give you. I don't want to indulge your fears. I don't want to indulge your fantasies. But I don't think it is likely that's where we're going to go. All right, let me stop there. Thank you.
If anyone has questions that they wrote down on cards, you want to send them down this way?
Or if you want to get the mic live,
Okay.
raise your hand.
Thank you for this. It made me a little.
I'm gonna come down here to hear, because the microphone's not resonating well. It's not you, it's the microphone.
Okay, all right.
It's like it's bouncing off the walls.
Oh, okay. It was nice listening to you. Maybe I'm a little more calmer after hearing your explanation, so thank you for that. But I'm curious about the voting role, the roles that Pam Bondi just requested.
Yeah.
What was the purpose of that, and how can they affect that? What does that all mean, and like how can it negatively impact the elections, or maybe get Trump like feeling positive about what's going on in Minnesota from an election standpoint?
Okay. Pam Bondi requesting those voting rolls never had anything really to do with voting on one level. What it was is the fact that if you can find out who votes, you can find out who is on, let's say, Medicare, that's what I'm looking for here. It's a way of what? Finding out who might be legally or not legally in the United States. And I want to come back to that statement, by the way. I want to come back to that statement here about documentation and immigrants in a minute here. Don't let me forget that. So somebody asked me that question in a second here. Okay, it was a backdoor way of doing that, to get to that information there. Because what? It's basically an effort to try to find out, basically part of their plan for trying to deport people. But it was also part of a way of what? Intimidating people. Because if you are a legal resident of the United States and you're voting, but you happen to be Hispanic, Somalian, or so forth, and you know the federal government, who has called you in the case of Somalians, garbage people, not my words, remember it's the president's here, isn't this a great way to scare and intimidate people from voting? Yeah, so this is about voter intimidation. It's about voter suppression. Okay, just to also let you know here, is that can the federal government compel the state of Minnesota to turn that information over? No, it cannot do that. The federal government, except in some very narrow situations, cannot order states around. And in fact, some of you might know about the lawsuit that the Attorney General brought against the federal government, saying that it's a violation of the 10th Amendment in terms of the ICE activities. The way I would describe it, I'm speaking as a law professor now, okay. They have an A argument with a B brief. And what I'm getting at here is that the argument was really good, potentially, that the federal government can't take a variety of activities to force states to do certain things. And Ellison's argument was the ICE activities in here were an effort to compel the state to act, to do certain things. Pam Bondi made Keith Ellison's argument if he thought about adding it to here. When she wrote the letter over the weekend saying, we'll end the ICE activities if you give us this stuff, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Godfather movies, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. That was coercive. The U.S. Supreme Court has consistently said you cannot coerce states to do certain things. And so I point this out. I point this out because the ICE activities, that letter, the demand for that information, the threat to cut off funding, all should be considered, if the Supreme Court were consistent, as unconstitutional efforts by the federal government to coerce states to do certain types of things. But since I won't forget, I remembered it now. I've done a few pieces to talk about this recently. Remember right off the bat, a violation of the immigration code is a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense. Excuse me, I'm sorry. If most of us think, I'm sorry, long day teaching. If most of us think that breaking the law means committing a criminal offense, merely being in this country by entering here, whatever we're going to call it here, entering it here without proper documentation, that is not a criminal offense. It is a civil offense. Second, even if it is a criminal offense, guess what? You're not a criminal until adjudicated by a court. And if it's only a civil offense, you're also not here illegally until what? You've been adjudicated by a court that says you're not here legally. The term illegal immigrants, I'll use the language of the law, is conclusionary. It's already made a conclusion about the status of people before the courts have actually made that decision. As I said to somebody the other day, at best that statement is incorrect. At worst, it's no more than a racial slur. So I don't even want to use that term. I mean, I don't know what the right term is to use here. Is the right term not documented, undocumented? I don't know what the right term is to use here. I'm grasping at it also. But the term illegal immigrant does not really mean anything. And so for them to be saying that we're here looking for illegal immigrants, well, the only way you could be looking for illegal immigrants would be what? For individuals who have been, if you go by the answer here, who have been adjudicated to be here illegally in the United States and have committed a crime. And at that point, what would you have? You would have a judicial warrant for their arrest. See where I'm going here? Most of what they're saying doesn't make any sense. But it's not about what makes sense. Part of what I'm saying here today, it is about voter suppression, or it's about race, or about a whole bunch of other things. That makes sense? Not saying I like this, but that's what's going on. Okay. Who else? This is actually easier for me. I can hear better this way. Because like I said, when you're speaking, it's kind of echoing off there. Okay, question. Is canceling the midterm elections a possibility? If so, no, it's not a possibility to do it. I'll just say it's right. It's not going to happen. Okay, I mean, what I'm trying to get people not to do is work themselves up into a tizzy, work themselves up into a fantasy or their worst case nightmares or something like that. No. I mean, again, if we get to the point where the President of the United States says there are no midterm elections, they're not being held, we're in limbo land at this point. And I mean that. We are in a point where we've never been in American history, and I don't know what the answer is. But right now, I think there is between 0% and no possibility that the midterm elections are going to be canceled in this country. Because guess what? Even if he somehow says, we're going to cancel the federal elections, which is not possible, because remember, Congress has to say it, can states still hold their own elections? Of course they can. And so this idea of saying it's going to happen, it's not going to happen. But if you are, what I don't want to see you folks doing is wringing your hands, worried yourself into a frenzy. What do you have to do? Okay, hold on a sec. I got to go up to my notes here for a second. I've got two great quotes for you. Hold on.
Florence Kennedy, don't agonize, organize. Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize.
What I'm getting at here is I'm glad to see 15,000 people show up on the streets the other day. How many of them do you think are registered to vote? I tell my students, my undergraduate students, who are worried about these things, and I say to them, you know what? The average college student, about 30% of you are registered to vote and will show up to vote. Because when they complain to me and say, no one listens to me, no one listens to young people, I say, well, hell, when you only 30% of you only show up to vote, I'm not going to listen to you either. I said, what if you turned out to vote in the same percentages that people over the age of 30 turn out to vote, which is over 60%? I said, suddenly you might actually be listened to. Remember, right now, among the millennials, actually I correct myself, among the Gen Zs who are under the age of 30, they are what? 80 million people. You put the millennials and Gen Zs together, they are the largest voting bloc in American history. What if they showed up to vote and the percentages that were similar than what we have for people who are older? They would rock. Another way I described it, I should point out, by the way, when I say this, Bernie Sanders is a friend of mine, a personal friend. I have family in Vermont many, many years ago. My cousin said, let's go to Burlington. We can go meet the mayor. I said, all right, who's the mayor? She said, Bernie Sanders. Okay, and I stayed in contact with them. But what I'm getting at here is that Bernie Sanders could get 25,000 young people out to a rally and 5,000 people out to vote. I'm serious. They didn't show up to vote. They're great about doing what? Going on Facebook, TikTok, wherever they are, and talking about things. What if we put our efforts, instead of what? Worrying and saying, let's get out there. Let's do what? Have one of the best voting organization efforts to get out people to vote we've ever seen in American history. There's a wonderful book, and the title's not important here, that talks about how we go about doing this. Think about, for most of you in this room here, the process for voting, we've learned how to do. We've learned how to what? We've learned how to what? Register to vote. We've learned how to budget our time. We've learned how to gather the information that we need. Think about voting as a supply chain, like in manufacturing. We need to not just We need to talk to young people, to people who are older, who are saying, I'm not voting, or I don't know how to vote. How to explain to them the process, how to register to vote, how to gather information, how to figure out what day to vote, how to vote in advance, how to maybe arrange a ride. Think of it like a supply chain that you are organizing. For those of you who have ever been in any business, and I owned a restaurant for a while too, you have to figure out, how do you order supplies? How do how do I order the food? How do I put together the help? How do I put together the cooks? Same thing. Think about what? Think about creating the supply chain, the chain that gets people to show up to vote. That's what's important to be able to do. That's what we have to figure out here as part of the process. Okay, that's one of the cards. Okay, who else?
But don't you think what you just said is more about the younger people looking at this, not the process so much, but the pay to play, the lobbyists, the PAC money, all of that, and they're just saying, this is just, everything is just, it's corrupt. And so why should I get involved with a corrupt system? And so how do you explain that to the kids?
A couple things here. First off, I agree. I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. You know, some of you might, I can't remember if in my introduction you read it here, is that I was the executive director for Common Cause Minnesota. For several years. I still think the fundamental issue in American society is the amount of money dumped into our political system. Okay. Again, I'm doing lots of stories today that I know they sound too self-referential. In 1998, on the 25th anniversary of the Saturday Night Massacre, you know, when Archibald Cox was fired by Richard Nixon, I brought Archibald Cox to Minnesota. And he said something absolutely brilliant, and I've stolen his line, and he gave me credit to use it. And he said, the rules that determine who's allowed to give money in politics are the rules that determine the rules of the game. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. It's Archibald Cox's comment. And he said, money determines the rules about who can give money determine the rest of the game. If we think of American elections as a board game, Risk, Monopoly, whatever board game like that. So I agree on that one level there, that money is the still fundamental problem in our political system, and we allow way too many people at way too much amount of money. Actually, I put it this way, we allow way too few people, because less than 2% of the American population gives money for campaigns and elections, and barely 200 families, 200 individuals in this country account for the lion's share of all the money spent in the system. It's quaint when you and I send $25 off, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so I agree with all that. But what I say to my students is that if you don't vote, you basically have let the other side win. You have basically conceded at this point. And I said that even though you may think your vote doesn't count, if you don't vote, it definitely doesn't count at that point. And I would rather at least go down swinging than not fight at all whatsoever. And so, and also remember, and this is the part that I would say to my students too, as I said, yeah, it's kind of quaint that you'll like something on Facebook, you'll send a text message to somebody. If that's just helping you to organize, okay. And it's great if you show up to a demonstration. That's okay. But guess what? Our political system still has an electoral connection. Voting is our system is still in part about who gets to be in Congress, who gets to be in our state legislatures. As I point out to my students, the profile of the average person who votes, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, although more females now vote than males, older and rich. The profile of the average person in Congress, white, Anglo-Saxon, etc. The profile of the average major interest group, average major political action committee. Do you think it's a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. Unless we do something to change the demographics and who shows up to vote, we're not going to change anything. And if you just simply say, it ain't gonna matter, and I said this at a talk I gave about 6 months ago in a different context. When somebody said to me, well, is Trump going to obey the courts? And I went through a whole bunch of scenarios and talking about what would happen if Trump doesn't. And the person kept saying to me, never going to work, never going to work, never going to work. And I turned to that person and I said, go home. Go home. And she got mad at me. And I said, why? I said, that you are exactly where they want us to be. If you have given up hope, that's exactly what the other side wants you to do. And so I say to my students, if you want to say there's no point, all right, fine, there's no point. Give up, go home, go play your video games, and leave me alone. Just leave me alone, because you've already given up, which means you've already given into the other side. And I don't know about you, I don't want to give in. I don't want to give up. I think democracy is worth fighting for. There's a famous phrase, 1787, Constitutional Convention is ended. Benjamin Franklin is walking out of Constitutional Hall. Someone barks out at him, so what kind of government do we have? And he says, a republic if you can keep it. His whole point was, we have to fight for it. I'm a long-term ACLU member. Was on our board here, on the board in Texas where I taught for years, been on 2 national ACLU boards. If anybody's a member of the ACLU, what is their message, their slogan? Vigilance is the price of democracy and the price of freedom. You just can't sit there and hope. You gotta go out there and keep fighting for it. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I say that to my students. Yeah.
So can we dig into your comment about voting and youth voting?
Yeah.
So if you look historically, were there periods where there was enough self-interest in young people to vote? Think about maybe Vietnam era or the Rock the Vote 90s era,
Yeah.
Arsenio Hall, saxophone playing,
Yeah.
versus now. Like, have we ever seen substantial youth vote turnout?
Okay, have we ever seen...
Dynamics behind that?
Okay, good. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. Have we ever seen in history substantial youth voter turnout? Now remember, of course, that we don't have 18-year-old right to vote until 1971. You know, some states had lowered it before that, but for the most part, let's just use our baseline of 1971 is when the amendment passes. 1972 is the first presidential election where across the board 18-year-olds have the right to vote. Roughly in 1972, it's about what? For those who are between 18 and 21, it's roughly about 28 to 29% voter turnout for college-age students. Okay, if I can define college age as 18 to 22, yeah, I know we got some older students, et cetera, but let's go with that. 50 years later, the turnout among college-age students is roughly about the same thing. It really hasn't budged over a 50-year period, which raises really interesting questions regarding why it has stayed that way. Okay, now there's a variety of reasons why I think it has stayed that way. Okay, one of them is the fact, when I talk to my students, and I speak as a political scientist now, we have good data that a lot of my students say, I just don't know how to vote. I don't know how to go about doing this. I don't know where to go. I don't know who to talk to, et cetera, like that. Some of it is about the fact that, especially for my 18-year-olds, and I don't know how many of you remember when you were 18 or have 18-year-olds at this point. When they're going off to college, the last thing they are thinking about is voting. They are thinking about what? Moving into a dorm, going away to school. They're thinking about what? All kinds of stuff that's out there at this point. And I hate to say it, but the voting isn't at the top of their list. They've got all the other anxieties of making that transition over there. 50%, and I always say this to people, 50% of going to college is what? Learning how to be an adult. So there's a lot of things that are going on out there. We also know that many states, Minnesota's not one of them, that has requirements that say you have to register 30 or 60 days before an election. Well, 60 days before an election, if you're going off to school in September, basically means what? if you're not already registered to vote at that point, you're going to miss out on it. So there's all kinds of things that are going on, now Minnesota does not fit into this category because we have early voting, day of election registration, all the things that we actually have not just the highest voter turnout in the country overall, we have the highest voter turnout for young people. But still, having said that, I teach at Hamline University. I can still tell you, and I say this to my students, I said this was in 2024, they all said they're really excited about the election. And I said, yeah, but I know only 1 of 3 of you are going to vote. No matter how excited we are. And so to me, we've got to be thinking, and this is stuff that I've been thinking about recently here. How do we create, and go back to what I'm saying here, how do we create the supply chain, the linkages? Because all of you here, assuming you're voting, have developed what I'm going to call it the voting capital to know how to vote, to know where to vote, so forth like that. The other thing that we need to do with younger people more is to figure out how to use peer pressure. Peer pressure to make it cool to vote, and to conversely make it, I hate to say this, a shame not to vote. I mean, for most of us here, if we've ever actually answered a survey or something like that, even if we haven't, did you vote in the last election? We're going to say yes, because what? We're kind of embarrassed if we don't, like that. So we've got to figure out some kind of way of making it cool, and at the process here, making it socially unacceptable among their peers to say they didn't vote. Because my students don't feel any shame at all whatsoever on it. Now, I understand there's a lot of other things that are going on out here. I don't want to downplay a whole bunch of economic and other factors that are out there that influence why people do vote or don't vote or something like that. But we need to be thinking about how, in many cases, we can create, again, especially for younger people, that those linkages that are out there at this point. Because that is, I think, a really big issue that we need to be addressing here. The fact that we've got an enormous reservoir of people who are just not showing up to vote. Additionally, we need to think about that enormous reservoir of people who are of low social economic status, poor people who can't turn out to vote. Because of what? We don't provide paid time off, and a whole bunch of other things. And so there's a lot of other things we can do. Minnesota's doing a lot of right things, but there's still a lot more we could also do in this state too. Yeah, 1 and then 2.
Yeah, you've made a persuasive case for getting out to vote.
Yeah.
And my question is a strategic one. You've kind of hinted at it. What do we who are sitting here tonight do, practically speaking, moving forward? And one suggestion would be our sphere of influence.
Yes.
People we know, the supply chain that's connected to us. Yes, talk it up, get after people frequently and shame them whenever possible.
Yeah.
If they're not going to vote or haven't voted. But thinking more, thinking bigger, more systemically, what might be done? Should we be connecting with a get out to vote group or some organized group that can leverage a larger number of people? What can we, ought we to be doing, we who are sitting here?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Okay, a few different things here. Okay, one of them, I think there's a great conversation to be had with, for example, how many of you are connected with the League of Women Voters? I think there's a great conversation to be had with the League of Women Voters in terms of, I mean, they've been in this game for almost 150 years, if not longer, or something like that. Hook up with them. Hook up with other organizations. Yeah.
Here, check out our website.
Yeah. Hook up with them. Volunteer to be election judges. Figure out, and this is the part where I'm telling you right now, I'm trying to come up in my brain some ideas for this too here. If I'm talking about the supply chain theory here, are there ways we can start to do things such as, I don't know what, going out and being part of voter registration drives? I know we can vote on the day of election, But we also know if people are registered to vote in advance, they're much more likely to vote. Can we go out there, do more community groups, community talks? Can we get out? Can we try to find ways for those of you who are connected to high schools? I mean, if I had a magic wand in my hand, I would first off be doing a civics education class last semester seniors in high school, of which it would culminate, among other things, getting people registered to vote, talking about how to vote, et cetera, like that. Are there things that we can do to start to create these kind of programs, if not through the schools, through neighborhoods? How many of you are involved in, I don't know, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts? I'm trying to think of, I don't know, soccer leagues, things like that. Can we start to use other organizations as ways of reaching out in a nonpartisan way? And it's got to be that way, of course, in a way to say, how do we create linkages? And how do we use these groups to reach people? To then talk about how to vote, where to vote, what to do like that. I mean, I wish I had the game plan, but these are some of the things that I would be thinking about. But there are some groups, for example, like, again, League of Women Voters. I'm not sure if Vote Smart is still in the game at this point. But there's some groups that are out there that have already have been doing this for years. Find them, talk to them. I don't know, how many of you are members of things like Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs or things like that? Let's go through those organizations and try to figure out ways of trying to reach people. Use those kind of structures. Because again, for most of us who are adults, if you approach people and say, let's talk about getting people registered to vote, people are going to say, yeah. Because if you say, what do you mean you don't want to get involved in a campaign to help people register to vote? Are you against voting or something like that? Remember, most of us think it's a shame or shameful not to want to vote. And so we can kind of use that guilt as maybe a way of kind of pushing people. That's sort of my theory. But again, I don't know if it's the right answer, but that's what I would be trying to do. Yeah.
I am on the local League of Women Voters.
Yay! Good.
And we do registration at cap and gown graduation for high school, so that is a good way. I'd like to, propose to you, the real challenge is the 30, 40-year-olds.
Yes.
Because they're so busy running their kids around and doing everything. And I say that the issues of today, in politics today, are complex.
Yes.
And they're not something that you can read a pamphlet on and then go vote. You really need to put the work in to understand and formulate an opinion for yourself in order to go and do that. So it's time. It's time for these people. And we have trouble just getting them to show up at their kids' school board meetings and things like that. So I think that is really the difficult group. The young group is kind of low-hanging fruit, but the 30 and 40-year-olds are the ones that are really hard. So I'd like you to just, comment on that. And if you could also just say something about the ERA.
Okay. What's interesting, if you look at who's been the best beneficiary of early voting in America, women with children. And I mention that because for the point you're making here, we have to understand and accept, unfortunately it's true, the sexual division of labor in America in terms of who's got primary responsibility for like what, carting the kids off to soccer games, et cetera. So you know what I'm getting at here, like that. Esme Murphy at WCCO, we've talked about this before, and I pointed out that working moms have benefited dramatically from early voting in America because they now have a longer period of time to be able to figure out when to vote to get there, because maybe on election day they got to cart their kids off to this event, that event, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm getting at here is that part of what we need to be thinking about here is also for that age group, and again, I don't know what the silver bullet is letting them know that there are a lot of opportunities besides just on election day, but it's in terms of being able to vote. But second, we now have to come back to how do we convince people that their vote matters? How do we give them the information that they to be able to be able to cast a vote what they feel like that they can feel like they're making an intelligent choice. I know when I talk to my college students, in part why they say they don't vote, in part is they say, well, they don't feel like they know enough. How do we provide that better education for the 30-somethings? Again, I don't know what the answer is. If I did, again, I wouldn't be standing here. But I take what you're saying is absolutely correct here. We need to figure out, again, for each age group, how do we target for different age groups the needs that they have for being able to get them out to vote? It's not a one-size-fits-all, as you pointed out. I absolutely agree with you. Okay. In terms of the ERA, that's a whole different day for a different discussion. That takes us in a different direction. Yeah. Okay. How about if I go around this way, a loop? Okay. Okay. I'll start with you, sir.
How would you and IE, how can we respond to claims of undocumented citizens voting and skewing elections?
How do we respond to the claim of undocumented citizens voting? I wish I could say facts work. But they don't. I mean, we can point out the fact that we've got national statistics. We can aggregate them. The number of undocumented individuals voting. Again, I don't want to quite say we can fit it into a handful, but it's a handful. And most of them who do vote, it's not because they intentionally decided to break the law. It's because for some reason, oftentimes an election official makes a mistake and declares them eligible to vote, or they're registered to vote when they're improper. Think about it. And you notice tonight, a lot of what I'm doing with you, I'm not giving you facts per se. I'm telling stories. You have to tell stories. How have any of you ever done any fundraising? How do you raise money? You tell stories. How many of you have been in sales? You tell stories. The narrative out there right now is that we've got hordes, if not millions, of what? Again, use that phrase, illegal immigrants voting. I wish I knew the answer. How do we create the counter narrative? How do we create the counter story? Yes, we've got real facts, but how do we weave those facts into a story, into a message? I wish I had that answer. I truly do. I mean, my specialty is political science. My specialty is not communications. Okay, I'm from New York, so we used to say anybody who's in advertising works on Madison Avenue. My background's not Madison Avenue, but we need to figure out that counter narrative. Again, I wish I could give you a better answer. The facts do not support the other side. The other side is making a very persuasive, fear-mongering argument. Okay, I think I had my loop going that way, and then over here. Go ahead, yeah.
So there was a youth movement with a group to talk about allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote.
Yes.
Specifically in school board elections,
right.
But moving forward. So then as we engage in this conversation and we think about engaging college students, are there some legs to the idea of allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, which they would still be living in their houses with their parents who are theoretically voting, and then they could build that capital in voting?
Okay. This is personal opinion, yes, I think so. I mean, to me, if we think about the institution, first off, if we think about democracy as the consent of the governed, and we should have some say over institutions that have control over our lives, next to parents, what's the most important institution that affects high school students? School elections, yeah. Now, should it be 17? Should it be 16? I don't know. I mean, from my own personal perspective, I would lower the voting age, at least in school board elections, to age 16. But that's a great debate for our society to do. Okay, actually, can I tell you a funny story about? Okay, so I'll tell you a funny story once. Okay, so it reminds me. Okay, so Hamline is right next to Hamline Hancock Elementary School, and it's got to be about 15 years ago that the elementary school said, "Can you come in and talk about what voting is?" And they said, keep in mind, we've got students from kindergarten to 6th grade. I'm thinking, Oh my God. How, and for those of you, that's a huge age group difference in terms of understanding. And I'm trying to think, how am I going to explain the concept of voting in elections? Okay, so this was in the fall, so I went to Target in the Midway, and I bought a shopping cart full of candy. Okay, then I bought 3 cans of canned spinach and a clear mixing bowl. Okay, now this was all in concert with the teachers there. Okay, so I came in, so I've got an assembly, got all these kids from K through 6th grade there, all sitting there. And they introduced me, and they said, Professor Schultz is coming about like that. And they said, we're going to talk about voting in elections today. And I said, but first, it's snack time. And they all got excited. And I said, we're going to have snacks, but we're going to have a vote on snacks. So I said, choice number 1 is candy. And I had I don't even know, I had Snickers bars, Hershey bars, et cetera, et cetera. And then, has any of you ever opened up a can of spinach and dumped it into a bowl? It goes plop. It's disgusting. Okay, I like spinach, but canned spinach is disgusting in my opinion. Okay, so we opened up the canned spinach, dumped it into the bowls, and I said, all right, how many want candy? And all the kids' hands went up. Okay. And remember, so it rigged in advance. And all the teachers voted in favor of spinach. Okay. But then I said to the students, I said, how many of you are registered to vote? And they all looked at me, didn't know what it was. And I said, well, because you're not registered to vote, you can't cast a ballot, and we're not going to have candy. We're going to have spinach for the snack. Like that. God, it was a great, I'm hoping 15 years later, those students remember that. But it was a way of reaching them in a way that they could understand, to say that you have to, isn't that a great idea? It took me forever to come up with that gimmick like that. But we need to come up with something like that in terms of, but I do believe, again, my own personal view on this one is that I would lower it to 16-year-olds anyhow, because we would have some evidence at that point that even though not everybody's going to vote at 16, it would have the effect of what? Getting people in the habit. Because remember, voting is a habit. We've all acquired it. It's a habit like exercising or eating or whatever. We have to build the habit of voting. That's the supply chain. Okay, so we have this way, around this way, and then up there. Go ahead. Gentlemen first, then you, then you. Go ahead.
Rural areas getting the word out that their postmark may not be the day they put it in the mail like they used to. And you get some areas where they put it in the mail, it may take 2 or 3 days before it hits a distribution center that puts the postmark on it, on their absentee ballots.
Yeah, this is a question about, if you can't hear back there, about people who live in rural areas, about getting it postmarked by the requisite date. First off, I don't have a good answer to that question. I'm confessing on there. Second, I think we have to basically tell people that. Get people to understand that issue there, and tell them about what? That effectively, if you want to be able to meet the postmark date, you might actually have to now say what? 7 days in advance or something like that. So again, think about the supply chain. And supply chains have what? Dates attached to them. Tell people to say that by such and such a date you have to do this, by such and such a date you have to do that, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know about you, but I have a whole bunch of things that I write in my calendar that I say, if something is due on a Saturday, I have it listed in my calendar for like Monday or Tuesday of that week, so that I know what I have to do. So think about it that way. Think of maybe voting as what? A time management issue. Maybe that's another way of describing it. How do we do a time management? Okay. You. Yes. And then here, and then way up there.
So part of this conversation, one of the things that strikes me, having lived in 3 different states and tried to vote in all of them,
right,
and then thinking about a population of young people and also of people that are experiencing poverty or economic distress, right? That's a pretty transient population. And so one of the things that I've often wondered about is, where are the organizations, the systems that help to ensure that people who are more transient population are able to get registered?
Yeah.
So that's one question,
yeah,
because I think about that as almost a suppression, and then another group of people that I often think about suppression that we haven't mentioned at all tonight are justice involved individuals. So I don't know if you have any comment on how we can help to limit the suppression of those people's votes.
Sure. In our ideal world, you're right, we would actually have the machinery of the governmental process doing everything it can to try to register people, get them to vote, and do all kinds of things. Minnesota's not bad, but I was going to say, I've lived in Florida, I've lived in Texas also. Neither of those states do anything in any kind of positive way to try to make it easier for people to vote. In fact, I would argue in many cases, they do what they can to make it as hard as hell to be able to vote here. Again, this may come back to what? This may come back to saying, for those of us who care, those of us who already vote, those of us who are already organized, we've got to do a better job at it. That's not the best answer in the world, but we've got to press upon people about that. I think again, your comment about the postmarks is actually a great one here, is to basically say that, listen, for those of you who might not otherwise care about the right to vote and think that a whole bunch of other people are doing bad things, you may not be able to vote because of what? About postmark issues, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we have to figure out ways of creating the incentives to create the narrative that says that if we don't worry about X, Y, and Z, you too are not going to be able to vote also. Again, I'm not sure it's the right answer, but it helps. I think you had your hand up. Did you? One of you?
I did. I wanted to follow up on an earlier comment you made about the flow of money and relating it back to your supply chain framework. If money is really driving into these politicians from a very limited few sources, isn't a rational choice to say, forget this whole voting thing, and we're going to use commerce and economic activity to get our rights represented through Congress and Senate?
That's certain.
So if we influence the big companies, because we buy or don't buy from them.
Yeah, I was going to say is that, I think one of the great things we can do in this country is what? Vote with our dollars in a different way. Is that, whether right now you're participating in the Target boycott or not, but to be able to say to corporations and say that we are not going to consume, we are not going to buy from you unless you do certain things. Or if you decide that you're going to give money to causes I don't support, I'm not going to support you. So I think, again, my students hear me say this phrase all the time, God bless America. Can we use the rules of commerce for economic boycott purposes and so forth? Yes, we can. There's no reason why we can't do that. And in fact, I would couple that with other tools. Remember, part of what you're hearing me say today, there is no silver bullet. There is no sort of like one size fits all. It's multiple tools we have to use to achieve what we want to be able to do here. Because too many people come to me and say, what's the one thing I can do? There ain't one thing you can do. Yeah, way back there. I need to.
I know we're almost out of time for this gentleman.
I know, yeah, I saw his hand.
Real quick, gerrymandering. So there the Texas court is allowing Texas legislature to gerrymander.
Right.
California court is doing the same thing. Is this going to be part of the expression of pissing match between red and blue states? And how is that going to affect the 2026 election?
Okay, so the answer is, without using the same language here, yes, we're going to see the different states fight off of one another. This is a consequence, again, like a whole different discussion of a different day. I would argue that the Roberts Court has been one of the most hostile courts to democracy that we have ever seen in American history. It's gutted the Voting Rights Act. It did Citizens United. It's upheld voter ID. It's allowed now for these, basically said that gerrymandering for partisan purposes is not justiciable. It's an absolutely horrible court when it comes to this. But yeah, we're going to see that happen. We're going to see this jerry-rigging back and forth. But what we're also starting to see is state courts are starting to kick into this battle also too, and say there may be some limits on what you do here. But yeah, I'm not going to discount the fact that we're going to see what California is going to do it, Texas is going to do it, other states are going to do it, et cetera, and it's going to be a really ugly process. It is. And I'm not discounting that. And I wish I could give you a better answer to that. I mean, part of what you notice I'm giving you today is that I'm not sugarcoating certain things here. I'm trying to basically tell you, based upon what I know, my years as a scholar, as a law scholar, as a political scientist, sort of what's true, what's not true. And my best guesses on some things. Okay, can I do, maybe, what time is it here? One last question, that's it. Then I want to go home and see my wife. We have one more?
Well, I have a three-part one. One is that...
Pick your one.
Well, this isn't a question, it's a so, in thinking about what I can do, I take my nephews out for their birthdays, and so we're going to have a conversation about are they registered to vote. And also my mother took me to my first caucus when I was in middle school, so that's something we can do also. And I'll skip the next one, but then, do all states have a paper trail?
No.
And if they don't, how can we assure that their elections don't get rigged?
Move to that state and vote. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. I mean, honestly, do you want Texans to have influence on Minnesota? No. Should Texans care about what Minnesotans think? God, no either. So there's, I mean, at best what you could do is if we could get national legislation to require paper trails, but for states, what they do on their own, can't do anything, except our own state. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.